Anyone paying attention will see that the West is going through a period of what can be called, to put it gently, disaffection. There is a palpable sense of frustration, of something, somewhere along the way, having gone wrong. We can see evidence of this in the US, in the UK, in France, in Spain, in Germany, in Austria, and elsewhere. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I believe that this is a response to an ideology that has dominated the West since the late 1970s. Let's take a few minutes and talk this through. In the post-war years, most countries embraced a form of capitalism that was moderated by government oversight, regulation, progressive taxation, and so forth. Then, in the late 1970s, Western economies started to stagnate. Unemployment was increasing, inflation was increasing, and governments were having a hard time just keeping the lights on, living up to their prior commitments. The response was neoliberalism. It wasn't called that originally, and the term itself originally meant something else. But that is the term that has come to define this mindset and worldview. The pantheon of this ideology were Hayek, Friedman, and perhaps most obviously, Thatcher and Reagan. Neoliberalism has come to mean a radical laissez-faire capitalism, where it is believed that an unregulated and unrestrained market will lead to economic prosperity for all, that the free market will look out for everyone's best interest and always find the best solution. It suggests that the market is the ultimate arbiter, and that government must be minimal, weak, and kept out of the way. Reagan's first inaugural address summed up this mindset. Quote, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem," end quote. Stephen Metcalfe, writing in The Guardian, summed up neoliberalism as believing, quote, "that competition is the only legitimate organizing principle for human activity," end quote. And as neoliberal ideology began to be implemented by Thatcher in the UK, by Reagan in the US, by Bob Hawke and Paul Keating in Australia, and even earlier by Erhard in Germany, it initially seemed to be having success. Unrestrained markets surged, stock markets boomed, and the wealthy grew wealthier. Eventually, even the political left, the Democrats in the US and Labour in the UK, surrendered and bought into the free market mantra. But as decades have passed, the promised trickle-down effect never happened. Incomes for the vast majority of people remained, in real terms, stagnant. The free markets simply moved factories and jobs to poor nations where labor could be purchased for pennies on the dollar, versus employing someone in a nation that required clean and safe workspaces, or where people expected to be able to live and survive and thrive on the income they were paid. And yet, politicians like Blair, Brown, and Cameron in the UK, or Clinton, Bush, and Obama in the US, and economists like Alan Greenspan, Paul Volcker, and Lawrence Summers kept telling people, stay the course, because someday you're going to be rich as well, and then you're not going to want that government meddling in your affairs nonsense. That boom, in real terms, for the middle and working class was always just around the corner. And we ended up with governments who say they can't find money for education, or health, or infrastructure, but can find billions for political deals to keep themselves in power, and trillions to fight wars. But as Lincoln was alleged to have said, you can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. And people have increasingly seen the game as rigged against the little guy. In 2008, the bottom fell out of economies around the world. It was just the latest bubble to burst, but it was a big one. So politicians and others with a vested interest in the free market convinced their citizens the real problem wasn't the market. No, instead it was outsiders. Immigrants, illegal or otherwise, refugees, minorities, or the LGBT community, anyone who looked, sounded, dressed, or acted different. It was their fault. They were to be feared, scorned, hated. And the media began hyping up terrorism, which only served to feed this frenzy. This is not to say that terrorism is not real. It is. It is terrible. But it certainly isn't anything new. With a few notable exceptions, even the scale hasn't changed. Only the reporting has. But I would suggest the politicians, the economists, the people riding these waves of boom and bust to their own advantage, they could not control the forces they had unleashed. These forces began to take on a life of their own. They turned, in many ways, against the very powers that have birthed them. Saw rising racism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment. And this, of course, fed the nationalist movements, in the UK with groups like the BNP and UKIP, in the US with the Tea Party and alt-right movements, in France with the National Front, and so on. And to separatist movements, like Scotland from the UK, or Catalonia from Spain, or the Flemish community in Belgium, or the Basques in France, and elsewhere. Now, to be clear, these separatist movements are nothing new. Many of them go back decades or centuries. And I am not commenting here on whether they're right or wrong for wanting to be separate. I'm merely suggesting that they are newly empowered by this disaffection. We have seen the rise of a form of populism where many seem to have a blow-it-all-up mentality. It's not working, so take a wrecking ball to the whole thing, to every institution, every alliance, every principle we once stood for. And the elites, they're not taking this sitting down. They're striking back, because they're afraid too. Afraid of a system which they built to keep themselves on the pedestal falling down around them. Just look at the brutal response in Spain to Catalonia having a vote on independence as one example. And this, of course, just feeds the rage of the crowd even further. And so, Brexit, Trump, Nazis marching in US cities, hate crimes rising 20% in major US cities and 29% in the UK. We all have very real concerns and objections to the way that things are going. The game is rigged, by the few against the many. People are right to be angry, but you know what angry people are not very good at? Thinking things through. It's easy to surrender to the mob mentality, to want to blame, to lash out at everyone, just hoping to hit someone. But it doesn't solve the problem. As lame as it may sound, the solution is not violence. We must venture out beyond the little bubbles that we've created for ourselves, online with social media as well as in the real world, both on the left and the right. And we need to engage, think, talk, debate. Identify and challenge your own dogmas. You're not always wrong, but you're not always right either. Someone who looks, sounds, dresses, acts, or thinks differently is not the enemy. We can learn from them, and they can learn from us. We will never agree on everything, but we can find common ground. But then we have to put that into action. Constructive action, building up, not tearing down. There are people out there who are trying to make a difference. Find them, roll up your sleeves and get to work. Help get the money out of politics so politicians are not selling their souls just to get elected. Support programs and policies that you believe in, not just a person or a political party. To be cynical for a moment, putting your faith in a person will almost always lead to you being let down. And when the mob calls for violence, keep your head, because we can make a difference. We can work together to create an economy that works for everyone. We can tackle climate change. We can build a society that, to borrow a phrase from Dr. King, judges people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We can. But right now, we aren't. Until next time, be good, and if you can't be good, be wicked well.